I mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals, and it was only a year ago when all the nations of the world came together and committed to the goals that are here on this screen. Look closely at these goals and think about how they differ from the Millennium Development Goals more than a decade prior. For the first time, the nations of the world have set goals that represent what is fundamental for the people in places like Greenland and throughout the world, that include goals on poverty, goals on hunger, but also goals on climate, on water, on food production, on life beneath the sea and life on land. And these goals represent the realization that the future of humanity is inextricably bound up with the future of the planet. They require every nation to think with its whole mind about all these goals, and the biggest choices nations make, the biggest choices that businesses make, to take them all into account. You cannot approach poverty and hunger without thinking about food production and thinking about ecosystems upon which people depend. You cannot think about life in the ocean without thinking about climate change, which is steadily acidifying the ocean and changing it utterly. And so these require all of us to think as a whole, to think in a holistic fashion, and to be smart about the choices that we make. Now, when you look at the Arctic from a historical point of view, a lot of the biggest decisions have been driven by singular concerns, whether it is how to get the most oil out of the ground. But we know that you can't just approach those issues without taking into account the voices of the people who live there. And we know that if we're going to think about the lives and the cultures of the people who live there, you can't just think about that without understanding the ecosystems upon which their cultures and their livelihoods depend. I don't know if Andy Revkin is in the audience, but I can tell you WWF has authenticated this photograph. It's real. It is a real polar bear, real cubs on a real iceberg, and was taken by a real person who was sitting in the audience. A year ago, I sat next to Scott Minerd at the board meeting of this Arctic Circle. And Scott talked about the Arctic Investment Protocol. And he talked about the inventory of hundreds of investment projects ready to go in the Arctic. And I looked at Scott and I said, that's great, but you really need an inventory of all the values in the Arctic to go next to your inventory of investment projects so that you can hold those investment projects accountable for how they influence the values that are here, whether that's ecological values, community values, cultural values, and to make decisions on that basis. And that started a year-long conversation between our team at WWF, the team at Guggenheim, and many others, and that has brought us here today. We are working hard on developing a database that builds on the extraordinary amount of science that's already out there in the field, but tees it up in a way that decision makers can use it. We are by no means ready to launch, and we ask anyone in the audience who is working on science, who is in a position to make decisions, whether it's in the private sector, the government sector, NGOs, or local communities, to engage us to help us develop this tool so that it doesn't just paint a large picture, but it tees up data to help make decisions. Now, if you ask me to envision what does that look like, imagine mapping the quality, the value of fisheries in the Bering Straits. Imagine mapping those values that are important to conservation groups like WWF. Imagine mapping shipping lanes in that same region and modeling what happens if you change the shipping lane slightly to all the other values that are there. It is the point at which we are making decisions, not just from an investment point of view, but from a design point of view, that we can begin to be smart and intelligent and think the way the Sustainable Development Goals compel us to do. So, if you were lucky enough to look at this and go to it, on Thursday afternoon, we provided wine and beer and many other things to those who attended the simulation games of what this might look like. And we gathered here in the HARPA Center, looked at data, looked at maps, groups made decisions about where to put mines, where to put regulations, where to put drilling sites, and where to think about conservation, and began to model the economic impact of different choices, but also the cultural impact, the impact on people's lives, the impact on the environment. It was an exciting, dynamic session, and we also offered prizes at the end, but it brought to life the power of this tool, and it gives us the ability to not just come together and think about all these in an academic sense, but to think about it in terms of real decisions on the ground. So I invite all of you who are interested in this topic to reach out to the 20 or so WWF staff representing all the Arctic nations who are gathered here. I think we occupy an entire row in this hall, but we have a booth out front. But to help us develop this tool, it will be open source, available to all, and we are in the process of development. But it holds the promise of enabling us to think about and hold in our brain all these different values, whether they're ecological, cultural, the values of local communities in making the biggest decisions in front of us, and to keep intact this glorious part of the world upon which we all depend. Thank you very much.